A furious millionaire allows a fragile, rejected beggar girl trembling with fever and begging for shelter to spend a single night in his cold garage. By morning, when he finds what she left behind, his heart breaks into 1,000 pieces. Falling to his knees, he weeps desperately. But first, each story is a new emotion. Subscribe now and don't miss moments that will surprise you and touch your heart. The rain lashed against the windows of the Campbell estate, a sprawling mansion perched on the outskirts of Boston. Inside, Richard Campbell sat alone in his study, a glass of 30-year-old scotch in his hand, his face illuminated only by the soft glow of a desk lamp and the occasional flash of lightning. At 52, Richard had achieved what most would consider the pinnacle of success, a fortune estimated at $2 billion, a global real estate empire, and a reputation as one of America's most shrewd businessmen. Yet as the storm raged outside, it merely echoed the emptiness within him, the trappings of wealth that surrounded him. The original Picasso hanging on the wall, the hand-carved Italian desk beneath his fingertips, the vintage liquor that cost more than what most Americans made in a month. None of it filled the void. Mr. Campbell, his housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, appeared at the doorway, her typically composed demeanor slightly unsettled. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir, but there's someone at the front gate." Richard glanced at the grandfather clock. At 11:30 at night? During this storm? His voice carried the edge that had made boardroom executives tremble. "Call security." "I did, sir, but—" Mrs. Winters hesitated. "It's a young girl. She appears to be ill. She's asking for you specifically." Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't know any young girls, Mrs. Winters. Tell security to send her away." He turned back to the financial report on his tablet, dismissing the matter. "She says she has something from your father, sir." The words hung in the air like smoke. Richard's father, Harold Campbell, had been dead for 3 weeks. The funeral had been small, attended primarily by business associates rather than friends or family, because Harold Campbell had no friends, and Richard was his only family. At least the only family Richard knew about. "Bring her in." The words left his mouth before he could consider them fully. "No, wait. I'll come down." The girl couldn't have been more than 13 or 14. She stood in the grand foyer, a small puddle forming beneath her worn sneakers on the imported marble floor. Her clothes were soaked through, a threadbare hoodie, jeans with holes that weren't fashionable but from genuine wear, and a backpack that had seen better days. Her dark hair clung to her pale face, and Richard could see she was shivering violently. "Who are you?" he demanded, maintaining his distance. My name is Emily," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "Emily D. Dawson." "I don't know any Dawsons." "You wouldn't," she replied, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to generate warmth. "But your D-Dad did. He knew my mom." Richard's expression hardened. Harold Campbell had been many things: ruthless businessman, strict father, unforgiving creditor. But he had also been a notorious womanizer, even after Richard's mother had allegedly abandoned them when Richard was only 5. The possibility that this girl was claiming to be his half-sister crossed his mind immediately. "What exactly do you want?" he asked coldly. Emily reached into her backpack with trembling hands and pulled out a sealed envelope, protected from the rain by a plastic sandwich bag. "He gave this to my mum before he died. Said to make sure it got to you if anything happened to him." Richard stared at the envelope. He recognized his father's handwriting immediately. "For Richard, to be opened after my death." "Why didn't he give this to his lawyer or put it with his will?" Richard asked suspiciously. "I don't know," Emily replied, her voice weakening. My mom was supposed to bring it, but she—" The girl swayed slightly, and Richard noticed the unnatural flush to her cheeks that contrasted with her otherwise pale complexion. "She died last month. Cancer." Mrs. Winters stepped forward, maternal concern evident in her expression. "Sir, this child is running a fever." Richard remained unmoved. "So, you've delivered your message?" I'll have my driver take you to a hospital." Emily's eyes widened with fear. "No, no hospitals, please. They'll put me in the system. I can't go back there." A violent cough racked her small frame, and she stumbled forward, catching herself on the banister of the grand staircase. "You can't stay here," Richard stated firmly, though something unfamiliar stirred within him as he looked at the desperate child before him. "Just one night," Emily pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the garage or anywhere. I'll be gone by morning, I promise." Another cough shook her body, and this time Mrs. Winters moved to support her. "Mr. Campbell, we can't send her back out in this condition, in this weather," the housekeeper said, her tone making it clear she would judge him harshly if he did. Richard looked from the letter in his hand to the girl's face. There was something in her eyes, a determination amid the fear and fever that struck him. It reminded him of himself as a young boy, trying to earn his father's approval, never quite succeeding. "Fine," he relented. "She can stay in the guest house tonight. Mrs. Winters, get her some dry clothes and something to eat, and call Dr. Parker to come check on her." Relief washed over Emily's face. "Thank you," she whispered, before another coughing fit overtook her. As Mrs. Winters led the girl away, Richard retreated to his study, the unopened letter heavy in his hand. Part of him wanted to tear it open immediately, but another part, the part that had learned to fear his father's words, hesitated. He poured himself another scotch and stared at the envelope for a long time before finally breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of his father's personal stationery, filled with his distinctive, precise handwriting. As Richard read, the blood drained from his face. The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. The letter trembled in his hands as the truth, a truth his father had hidden for over 4 decades, was finally revealed. "Richard, if you're reading this, I am dead, and my cowardice has outlived me. I have lived with this secret for 47 years, and I cannot take it to my grave. Your mother did not abandon you. Everything I told you about Margaret, that she left us, that she chose a new life over her own son, that she never loved you enough to stay, was a lie. I fabricated that story to keep you close, to ensure your loyalty, and to punish her for defying me. The truth is that I drove her away. My gambling debts in those days had attracted dangerous men. When they threatened you, a 5-year-old boy, to get to me, your mother made a sacrifice no parent should ever have to make. She fled, drawing their attention away from you, knowing they would follow her instead. She left everything behind, her home, her possessions, her child, to save your life. I let you believe she abandoned you because my pride couldn't bear the truth, that she was stronger than I was, that she faced danger I had created, and that she loved you more than life itself. I don't expect your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But Margaret does deserve to know her son. The girl who brought this letter, Emily, her mother Jane, was your mother's closest friend in the years before she had to run. If Margaret is still alive, Jane would know how to find her. It's too late for me to make amends, but it's not too late for you, Harold Campbell." Richard read the letter 3 times, each reading more painful than the last. 47 years of believing his mother had chosen to leave him. 47 years of hardening his heart against abandonment by never letting anyone get too close. 47 years of becoming more and more like the man who had lied to him. The truth crashed through him like a wrecking ball, demolishing every wall he had built, every assumption he had made about his life, his worth, his capacity to be loved. He didn't realize he was crying until the tears splashed onto the letter, smudging the ink. His shoulders began to shake, and for the first time since he was a small boy, Richard Campbell wept openly, uncontrollably. He wept for the mother he had been taught to hate. He wept for the life they could have had. He wept for the man he might have become if he had known the truth. When the tears finally subsided, Richard wiped his face with his sleeve, an uncharacteristically messy gesture for a man who prided himself on perfect composure. He carefully folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. Then he stood up, straightened his shirt, and headed toward the guest house where a sick, orphaned girl, his one tenuous connection to the mother he never knew, was sleeping. The storm continued to rage outside, but within Richard Campbell, something long frozen had begun to thaw. Morning light filtered through the guest house windows, casting warm patterns across Emily's sleeping form. Richard Campbell stood in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, studying the girl who had upended his world overnight. Dr. Parker had come and gone, diagnosing Emily with pneumonia, administering the first dose of antibiotics, and leaving strict instructions for her care. She needs rest, fluids, and monitoring, the doctor had told Richard. This isn't something to take lightly, especially given her malnourished state. Now, watching the steady rise and fall of Emily's chest beneath the plush down comforter, Richard felt utterly out of his depth. He'd overseen multi-million-dollar real estate developments, navigated complex international business deals, and managed a global empire with thousands of employees, but he had no idea how to care for a sick child. Mr. Campbell, Mrs. Winters appeared beside him, carrying a tray with toast, scrambled eggs, and orange juice. "How is she this morning?" "Still sleeping," Richard replied, his voice lower than usual. "Dr. Parker said the fever broke around 4 a.m. Mrs. Winters nodded approvingly. "That's good news. I've prepared breakfast for when she wakes up." She paused, giving Richard a measured look. "And what are your plans for her, sir?" The question hung in the air. What were his plans? 12 hours ago, his answer would have been simple: get her healthy enough to leave, maybe give her some money and send her on her way. But the letter had changed everything. "I need to talk to her," Richard said finally. "Find out what she knows about my mother." As if on cue, Emily stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Confusion crossed her face as she took in the luxurious surroundings before her gaze settled on Richard, and recognition dawned. "Good morning," Richard said awkwardly. Emily pushed herself up against the pillows, wincing slightly. "Morning," she replied, her voice hoarse but stronger than the night before. "What time is it?" "Just after 9. How are you feeling?" "Better." She eyed the breakfast tray that Mrs. Winters was setting on the bedside table. "Is that for me?" "Of course it is, dear," Mrs. Winters said warmly. "You need to build up your strength." Emily's eyes widened at the spread before her. Clearly, such a breakfast was not something she was accustomed to. "Thank you," she said softly, reaching for the orange juice with still trembling hands. Richard cleared his throat. "Mrs. Winters, would you give us a moment?" The housekeeper nodded and left, closing the door behind her. Richard took a seat in the armchair beside the bed, unsure how to begin. "So," Emily said between careful sips of juice, "did you read it? The letter?" "I did." Richard's hands tightened around his coffee mug. "How much do you know about what was in it?" Emily shook her head. "Nothing specific. My mom never told me what it said, just that your dad gave it to her before he died and made her promise to get it to you." She set the juice down and turned to face him fully. "He came to our apartment a few times over the years, always looking really serious, always talking to Mom privately. I never knew why until the last time, when he was really sick. That's when he gave her the letter." Richard studied her face, looking for any resemblance to his father, any hint that his suspicion about her being a half-sister might be true, but he saw nothing of Harold Campbell in her features. "Your mother, Jane, was it? How did she know my father?" "She didn't, not really," Emily replied, picking at a piece of toast. "She knew your mom. They were friends a long time ago, before I was born." Richard felt something catch in his throat. "My mother? Margaret Campbell?" Emily nodded. "Mom used to tell me stories about her, said she was the bravest person she ever knew." She hesitated, watching Richard's reaction carefully. "What did the letter say? Was it about your mom?" Richard stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the manicured lawns of his estate. Part of him wanted to shut down this conversation, to retreat behind the walls of detachment that had served him so well in business. But another part, The part that had cried last night for the first time in decades needed answers. "Yes," he said finally. "It was about my mother. All my life. I believed she abandoned me when I was 5 years old. My father told me she chose a new life over her family." He turned back to face Emily, but according to his letter, that was a lie. "She left to protect me, to draw dangerous men away from me because of my father's gambling debts." Emily's eyes softened with sympathy. "That matches what my mum told me. She said your mum had to make an impossible choice, and your mother kept in touch with her. All these years. They wrote letters sometimes, no return addresses, no phone calls that could be traced. Mum was super careful about it." Richard felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by caution. "Do you know where she is now?" "My mother?" Emily's face fell. "No. The letters stopped coming about 5 years ago. Mum tried to find her through some old contacts, but no one knew anything." She pushed aside the breakfast tray and hugged her knees to her chest. "That's part of why I came to find you. Mum made me promise before she died that I'd deliver the letter and then try to find Margaret. She said maybe together we'd have a better chance." Richard sat back down, processing this information. "Together? What made your mother think I'd help you?" Emily shrugged, suddenly looking very young and vulnerable. "She said once you knew the truth, you'd want to find your mom as much as your mom would want to be found." She met his gaze directly. Was she wrong? The question struck Richard like a physical blow. Would he want to find the mother he'd spent a lifetime resenting, now knowing she had sacrificed everything for him? The answer came to him with surprising clarity. "No," he said quietly. "She wasn't wrong." A small smile touched Emily's lips before another coughing fit overtook her. Richard automatically reached for the glass of water on the nightstand and held it out to her. "Take small sips," he instructed, echoing what he'd heard Dr. Parker say the night before. Once her coughing subsided, Emily looked up at him with questions in her eyes. "So, what happens now? With me, I mean?" It was the question Richard had been avoiding since Mrs. Winters first posed it. The practical, logical choice would be to arrange proper care for the girl, perhaps a good foster home, or even a boarding school he could pay for. That would be the sensible thing to do. He wasn't equipped to care for a child. His life wasn't designed for it, but then he thought of his mother, forced to leave her son behind, never knowing what became of him. He thought of Jane Dawson, making a deathbed promise to get a letter to a stranger and to help a lost girl find a lost woman. And he thought of Emily, brave enough to journey to a millionaire's mansion in a storm, sick and alone, to fulfill her mother's final wish. "You'll stay here," Richard said, surprising himself with the decisiveness in his voice. "At least until you're fully recovered. Dr. Parker says that will take a couple of weeks." "And then?" Emily pressed. Richard hesitated. "Then we'll figure out our next steps, together." Relief washed over Emily's face, quickly followed by a flicker of suspicion, the hard-earned wariness of a child who had learned not to trust too easily. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." It was a fair question, one that Richard himself wasn't entirely sure he could answer. "Because you're my only connection to the truth," he said finally, "and because I think we might be able to help each other." Emily studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Okay," she said, her voice small but resolute. "Okay." Richard stood, suddenly uncomfortable with the unexpected emotion of the moment. "You should rest. Eat your breakfast. I'll check on you later." He was almost to the door when Emily's voice stopped him. "Mr. Campbell." He turned. "Yes? Thank you," she said simply, "for not sending me away." Richard nodded stiffly, unsure how to respond to her gratitude. As he closed the door behind him, he realized that in his 52 years, very few people had ever genuinely thanked him for anything. His wealth and power typically ensured compliance, not gratitude. The difference was unsettling. Back in his home office, Richard stared at his father's letter, now carefully preserved in a desk drawer. Then he did something he'd never done in his professional life. He cancelled all his meetings for the week. His executive assistant, Barnes, couldn't hide his shock. "Everything, sir? Even the Tokyo conference call?" "Everything," Richard confirmed. "Family emergency." The words felt foreign on his tongue. Family. For most of his life, that word had meant only himself and his father, a cold, transactional relationship built on mutual ambition rather than affection. Now, with his father dead and the possibility of finding his mother alive, the concept of family seemed both terrifying and tantalizing. After hanging up with Barnes, Richard opened his laptop and began what he knew best: research. He needed to know everything about Jane Dawson, about Emily's background, and most importantly, he needed to start the search for Margaret Campbell. Hours later, he had compiled a dossier that would impress his corporate intelligence team. Jane Dawson had been a nurse at Boston General, a single mother who had struggled financially but maintained a small apartment in one of the city's working-class neighborhoods. She had died 6 weeks ago after a short but aggressive battle with pancreatic cancer. There was no record of Emily's father, and no other family members were listed in any of Jane's documentation. As for Emily herself, she had been a good student until her mother's illness forced her to miss substantial school time. After Jane's death, Emily had apparently slipped through the cracks of the system, not formally registered as a ward of the state, but with no legal guardian either. She had been essentially homeless for the past month, yet had somehow managed to avoid being picked up by social services. The girl had grit, Richard had to acknowledge, a survivor's instinct that, despite himself, he respected. Finding information about his mother proved more challenging. Margaret Campbell had effectively disappeared 47 years ago. The last official record of her was a Massachusetts driver's license that had expired the year after she left. Richard ordered his security team to dig deeper, but he knew this would be a more complicated search. As evening fell, Richard made his way back to the guest house, where he found Emily sitting up in bed, leafing through a book from the room's small collection. Her color looked better, and she'd changed into clean pajamas that Mrs. Winters must have provided. "The Call of the Wild," Richard noted, recognizing the book in her hands. "Jack London." Emily nodded. "Have you read it?" "A long time ago," Richard replied, taking a seat. "It was one of my favorites as a boy." "Mine too," Emily said, closing the book carefully. "My mum used to read it to me when I was little." An awkward silence fell between them, neither quite sure how to proceed with this strange new arrangement. "I've done some research," Richard finally said, "about your situation." Emily tensed visibly. "Are you going to call social services?" "Not if you don't want me to," Richard assured her. "Legally, I should, but I understand your reluctance." He studied her face, noting the way her shoulders remained tight with anxiety. "I have a proposal." "What kind of proposal?" "Stay here while you recover. No social services, no system. In return, you tell me everything you know about your mother's connection to mine. Any details, any memories, anything that might help us find her." Emily considered this. "And after I get better? What then?" Richard hadn't planned that far ahead, which was unusual for a man who typically mapped out business strategies 5 years in advance. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," he said, echoing a phrase his father had always despised for its lack of concrete planning. "That's not much of a guarantee," Emily pointed out, with a directness that reminded Richard of his most straightforward board members. "No," Richard agreed, "it's not, but it's the best I can offer right now." Emily fidgeted with the edge of the comforter, clearly weighing her options, which Richard realized were extremely limited. "Okay," she finally said, "but I want to help with the search. For your mom. I promised my mom I would." Richard found himself oddly moved by her determination. "We'll work together," he agreed, extending his hand formally as he would to a business partner. "Deal?" Emily looked at his outstretched hand with surprise, then reached out to shake it. Her small hand disappeared within his larger one, the contrast between them striking. his manicured and adorned with an expensive watch, hers thin and bearing the small calluses of a harder life. "Deal," she said firmly. As Richard left the guest house that evening, he was struck by the strangeness of the situation. Yesterday, he had been Richard Campbell, billionaire CEO, a man defined by his wealth, power, and solitude. Today, he was, what? A reluctant guardian to an orphaned girl? A son who had just discovered his mother might still be alive? A man whose carefully constructed identity was crumbling at the foundations. Whatever he was becoming, Richard knew one thing with certainty: nothing would ever be the same again. 2 weeks passed in the Campbell estate with a rhythm that gradually became familiar. Each morning, Richard would take breakfast in the guest house with Emily, reviewing her improving health with the precision of a corporate quarterly report. Dr. Parker visited every 3 days, noting with satisfaction the girl's steady recovery from pneumonia. Mrs. Winters, who had initially viewed the arrangement with skepticism, now moved between the main house and guest house with a maternal vigilance that surprised even herself. For Richard, these weeks were unlike any in his adult life. He worked remotely, taking only the most essential calls, declining meetings that would normally have been non-negotiable. His executive team was bewildered by this unprecedented behavior, but none dared question it directly. Richard Campbell had earned the right to his eccentricities. On this particular morning, exactly 15 days after Emily's arrival, Richard entered the guest house to find her not in bed, but sitting at the small writing desk, a notebook open before her. "You're up early," he observed, setting down the leather portfolio he carried everywhere. Emily looked up, her color now healthy, her eyes clear and alert. "I feel good today, really good." She gestured to the notebook. "I'm writing down everything I can remember about what my mom told me about your mom, trying to organize it." Richard nodded approvingly. It was the kind of methodical approach he would have taken himself. "Dr. Parker is coming at 11. If he clears you, I thought we might move you into the main house. The blue room has a better view, and it's closer to the library." Emily's eyebrows rose. "The main house? Are you sure?" In truth, Richard wasn't entirely sure why he'd made the offer. The guest house was perfectly comfortable, luxurious by most people's standards, and having Emily there maintained a certain distance that had felt safe. But something had shifted over these 2 weeks. The awkwardness of their initial interactions had given way to a cautious rapport. Emily was bright, observant, and remarkably self-sufficient for her age. She didn't demand attention or emotional engagement, which suited Richard's reserved nature. "It makes practical sense," he said finally. "Easier for Mrs. Winters to look after you, and we can work more efficiently on our project." Emily smiled slightly at his businesslike explanation. "Okay, thanks." Richard cleared his throat and opened his portfolio. "I've compiled everything we know so far about my mother's disappearance and possible whereabouts." He spread several documents on the desk beside Emily's notebook. "My team has been discreet, but thorough." Emily leaned forward, examining the timeline Richard had created. "This is really good, like detective work." "What we need now are your memories," Richard said. "Anything your mother might have mentioned about my mother's locations over the years, people she knew, jobs she might have taken." Emily closed her eyes, concentrating. "Mom said they were careful about never writing down addresses or specific locations, but I remember her mentioning a few cities your mom had lived in." She opened her eyes. "Chicago, I think, and somewhere in Arizona, Flagstaff maybe, and definitely New Orleans. Mom said Margaret loved New Orleans." Richard added these locations to his notes. "That helps narrow our search parameters." "What about names? Did she ever use a different name?" "Different names for different places," Emily confirmed. "Mom called them her safe names. I remember Grace was one. Grace Sullivan, I think." Richard's pen paused above the paper. "Sullivan was my mother's maiden name." "That makes sense," Emily said. "Mom said your mother always kept something from her real life in her new identities. A middle name, or her mother's name, something to hold on to. Richard felt an unexpected tightness in his chest as he wrote down Grace Sullivan. The idea that his mother had held onto pieces of her true identity throughout her years in hiding moved him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "What else do you remember?" he pressed gently. Emily furrowed her brow. "She worked with kids. Mom said that was constant, no matter where she went or what name she used. Working with kids in some way, teaching, daycare, something like that." Richard nodded, adding this to his notes. "That's helpful. Any physical description? Recent description, I mean." His own memories of his mother were hazy at best. A soft voice, the scent of lavender, a gentle hand brushing hair from his forehead. He had been only 5 when she left. "Mom saw her maybe 7 years ago," Emily said uncertainly. "She said your mom's hair had gone mostly gray, but she was still pretty, small like me. She had a scar on her right hand from a cooking accident." Each detail felt like a precious artifact to Richard, pieces of a mosaic portrait slowly taking shape. This woman, this stranger who was his mother, was becoming more real with each recollection Emily shared. "There's something else," Emily said hesitantly. "Something important." Richard looked up from his notes. "What is it?" "Those men, the ones your dad owed money to. Mom said your mom was still careful, even after all these years. She never stayed in one place too long, never used social media or had her picture taken if she could help it." Emily met his gaze directly. "She was still afraid, Mr. Campbell, even after all this time." The implication hung in the air between them. If Margaret Campbell was still in hiding, still protecting herself from threats nearly 5 decades old, finding her might be more complicated and potentially more dangerous than Richard had imagined. "We need to be careful how we look for her," Emily added quietly. "Mom always said if anyone came asking direct questions about Margaret Campbell, she'd disappear again in a heartbeat." Richard set down his pen, considering this new complication. "Then we don't look for Margaret Campbell," he said decisively. "We look for Grace Sullivan and the other names she used. We trace her through her work with children, through the cities she lived in, and we do it quietly." Emily nodded, relieved that he understood. That's what Mom would have done. The sound of Mrs. Winters knocking at the door interrupted their strategy session. "Dr. Parker has arrived early," she announced. The examination was brief but thorough. Dr. Parker, a man who had tended to the Campbell family for 3 decades and whose discretion was absolute, declared Emily fully recovered from pneumonia, though still in need of proper nutrition and rest to regain her full strength. "She's a fighter, this one," the doctor remarked to Richard as they stepped outside the guest house to speak privately. "Yes," Richard agreed. "She is." Dr. Parker hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Richard, I've known you since you were a young man. I've never seen you take a personal interest in anyone quite like this. May I ask what your intentions are regarding the girl?" It was a fair question, one that Richard himself had been avoiding. "For now, she stays with me. She has information I need and nowhere else to go." The doctor's expression remained neutral. "And when you no longer need that information?" Richard felt a flicker of irritation. "I don't know yet. One step at a time." Dr. Parker nodded, accepting the non-answer. "Just be aware that children form attachments quickly, especially those who have experienced loss. Whatever your eventual decision, proceed with caution." The warning stayed with Richard throughout the day as he helped Emily move into the blue bedroom in the east wing of the main house. It was a room that had rarely been used, reserved primarily for the occasional business associate who required overnight accommodation. Like most rooms in the Campbell mansion, it was impeccably decorated but impersonal, expensive furnishings without warmth. Watching Emily place her few possessions on the dresser, a worn paperback, a small wooden box, a faded photograph of her mother, Richard was struck by how little physical evidence there was of her 13 years of life. "We should get you some clothes," he said abruptly, "and whatever else you need." Emily looked up, surprised. "These are fine," she said, gesturing to the borrowed clothes Mrs. Winters had provided simple items purchased hastily online and delivered to the estate. "They don't fit properly," Richard observed. "We'll have my personal shopper come tomorrow. She can help you select appropriate items." Emily shifted uncomfortably. "You don't have to do that." "It's not a matter of having to," Richard replied. "It's practical. You need clothes that fit." Emily didn't argue further, but Richard sensed her discomfort with his generosity. It was a reaction he wasn't accustomed to. Most people in his orbit were eager to accept whatever material benefits his wealth could provide. "What's in the box?" he asked, changing the subject. Emily's hand moved protectively toward the small wooden container. "Just some things of my mum's." And she hesitated, then opened the box and removed a folded piece of paper. "This might help us." She handed the paper to Richard. It was a photograph, worn at the edges and slightly faded. In it, two young women in their 20s stood arm in arm, laughing at the camera. With a jolt of recognition, Richard realized he was looking at his mother. "That's Margaret on the right," Emily confirmed, "and my mum on the left. It was taken before everything happened." Richard stared at the image, transfixed. The woman in the photograph bore little resemblance to the hazy figure in his childhood memories. This Margaret Campbell was vibrant, confident, beautiful, her eyes crinkled with laughter, her dark hair falling in waves around a heart-shaped face. Looking at her features, Richard could see echoes of his own. The same determined set of the jaw, the same slight asymmetry to the smile. "Mom kept it hidden," Emily explained. "She said it was too dangerous to have out, but she couldn't bear to destroy it. It was the only picture she had of them together." "May I keep this?" Richard asked, his voice uncharacteristically rough. "I'll have it digitized and returned to you." Emily nodded. "Of course." She hesitated, then added, "There's something else." She reached back into the box and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. "Mum said your mother left this with her for safekeeping. She was supposed to give it back next time they met, but..." She shrugged sadly. "That never happened." Richard took the locket carefully, turning it over in his palm. It was oval-shaped, simple in design, with a delicate floral pattern engraved on its surface. With slightly trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside, on one half, was a tiny photograph of a baby. Himself, he realized with a shock. And on the other half, inscribed in minute letters, "My heart, outside my body." Richard stared at the inscription, then at the baby photo, feeling as though something fundamental was shifting inside him. All these years, he had believed himself unwanted, discarded. But his mother had carried his image close to her heart, had thought of him as her heart outside her body. The narrative he had built his life around, that he wasn't worthy of love, that abandonment was inevitable, suddenly seemed built on sand. "Are you okay?" Emily asked quietly. Richard closed the locket with a soft click. "Yes," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. "Thank you for this. It's significant." That night, after Emily had gone to bed, Richard sat alone in his study, the locket on the desk before him, the photograph of his young mother beside it. He poured himself a scotch, but left it untouched as he opened his laptop and began a new search. This time not for Margaret Campbell, but for Grace Sullivan, a woman who worked with children, who had lived in Chicago, Flagstaff and New Orleans, and who might now be anywhere in the country. It was like looking for a ghost, but Richard Campbell hadn't built a business empire by shying away from challenges. If his mother was still alive, he would find her. And if those threats from the past still existed, he would neutralize them. He owed her that much and more. As the search algorithms began their work, Richard opened the locket once more, studying the baby's face, his face, and the words his mother had chosen to keep close to her heart all these years. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Campbell allowed himself to hope for something that couldn't be bought, acquired, or negotiated, a chance to heal the wound that had shaped his entire existence. Across the mansion, in the blue bedroom, Emily too was awake, staring at the ceiling and contemplating the strange turn her life had taken. A month ago, she had been holding her mother's hand as she slipped away. 2 weeks ago, she had been sleeping in shelter doorways, fighting off fever and desperation. And now she was here, in this palace of wealth and privilege, bound to a cold, complicated man by a shared mission and fragile trust. She wasn't naive enough to believe this arrangement would last. Once Richard Campbell found his mother, if he found her, he would have no further use for a 13-year-old orphan. But for now, she had a roof, food, and purpose. And maybe, just maybe, she could fulfill her promise to her mother before whatever came next. Emily clutched her own keepsake under the expensive sheets, a hospital bracelet that had been on her mother's wrist when she died. "I'm trying, Mom," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm really trying." New Orleans greeted them with heavy, perfumed air that clung to their skin as they stepped out of the private car. Richard's townhouse in the Garden District stood like an elegant dowager among the oak-lined streets, a restored 19th century home with wrought iron balconies and a discreet wealth that complemented the neighborhood's genteel charm. "It's like walking into a storybook," Emily whispered, taking in the lush surroundings as butler Richard's New Orleans property manager showed them inside. The interior was a tasteful blend of historical details and modern luxury, crystal chandeliers hanging above, contemporary furniture, antique moldings framing smart home technology. Unlike Richard's Boston mansion, this place felt more personal, as though someone had actually lived here rather than merely occupied space. "Everything has been prepared as requested, Mr. Campbell," Butler said, a tall man whose formal manners masked shrewd intelligence, "including the additional room for Miss Emily." "Thank you, Butler," Richard replied, handing him a slim folder. "These are the appointments I've added. Since we last spoke, please arrange transportation accordingly." Emily stood quietly beside Richard, playing her part as the well-behaved ward. She wore a simple navy dress and cardigan, appropriate for a business associate's daughter, neither flashy nor childish. The past 2 days had been a crash course in how to behave in Richard Campbell's world, with Mrs. Winters drilling her on everything from table manners to conversation topics suitable for business settings. "Will you need anything else?" "This evening, sir?" Butler inquired. Richard glanced at Emily. "Dinner at 7, I think, something light." "Very good, sir. Miss Emily, if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." When Butler had gone, Emily's composure broke into excited exploration. She moved through the rooms like a curious bird, taking in the artwork, the books, the view from the balcony that overlooked a courtyard garden. "How many houses do you have?" she asked, running her fingers along the spines of leather-bound books. "6," Richard answered, checking his phone for messages. "Boston is my primary residence. This one I keep for quarterly business in the Gulf region. Then there's the Manhattan apartment, the ski lodge in Aspen, the villa in Tuscany, and a small place in London." Emily shook her head in amazement. "And you live alone in all of them?" The question was innocent but penetrating. "Yes," Richard admitted, feeling the strangeness of it through her eyes, "though I rarely spend time in most of them." "Don't you get lonely?" Richard looked up from his phone, surprised by her directness. "I'm used to solitude." Emily seemed about to say more, but thought better of it. Instead, she returned to the purpose of their trip. "So, tomorrow we visit the Crescent City Children's Haven?" "Yes. I've arranged to tour the facility at 11, under the guise of potential philanthropic interest." Richard set his phone aside. "Remember what we discussed. You're to observe and listen. I'll do the talking." "I know," Emily assured him. "I'll be completely professional." Richard found himself believing her. In the month they'd spent preparing for this trip, Emily had demonstrated a maturity and self-control remarkable for her age. She understood what was at stake. "Get some rest tonight," Richard advised. "Tomorrow will be a full day." The Children's Haven occupied a converted Victorian home in a neighborhood that had seen better days, but retained a certain dignity. The building itself was well maintained, with a colorful mural of children holding hands across the front fence and a small playground visible in the back. Richard and Emily were greeted at the entrance by a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes behind stylish glasses. "Mr. Campbell, I'm Delia Martinez, Executive Director. We're so honored you've taken an interest in our little haven." "The pleasure is mine," Richard replied, with the practiced charm he reserved for business meetings. "May I introduce my ward, Emily? She's been assisting me in researching worthy causes." Delia bent slightly to offer her hand to Emily. "It's lovely to meet you, Emily. We don't often get young people interested in the administrative side of non-profits." "I'm learning a lot," Emily said with a polite smile. "Mr. Campbell believes in hands-on education." Richard suppressed a smile at her perfect delivery. They had rehearsed this exchange, but she made it sound natural. "Well, let me show you around," Delia said, leading them into a bright reception area decorated with children's artwork. "We serve about 70 children weekly, offering therapy, after-school programs, and emergency services for those in crisis situations." The tour was comprehensive, with Delia explaining each program with obvious passion. Richard asked appropriate questions, expressing particular interest in their art therapy program, the opening they had been waiting for. "Art therapy has always been one of our cornerstone services," Delia explained, as they entered a sunlit studio filled with easels, clay stations, and a spectacular mural spanning one wall. Children who can't express trauma verbally often find release through creative expression. Richard nodded appreciatively. "The mural is exceptional. That was a community project led by one of our former therapists," Delia said, her face warming with memory. "Grace had a special gift for bringing out creativity in even our most withdrawn children." Emily's posture subtly changed, though her expression remained neutral. Richard continued smoothly. "Grace, was she with your organization long?" "About 3 years," Delia replied. "Grace Sullivan, one of the most intuitive therapists we've ever had." The children adored her. Richard feigned mild interest. "What happened to her? Did she move to another organization?" A shadow crossed Delia's face. "She left rather suddenly, actually. Said she needed to relocate for family reasons. It was a significant loss to our program." "I imagine so," Richard said sympathetically. "Did she specify where she was headed?" Delia shook her head. "No, she was quite private about her personal life. Though I did receive a donation in her name about a year after she left from Savannah, Georgia. I always assumed she'd settled there." Emily and Richard exchanged the briefest of glances. "A lead. That's quite common in this field, I understand," Richard said casually. "Burnout leads to high turnover." "Oh, it wasn't burnout with Grace," Delia corrected. "She was truly called to this work. In fact," she hesitated, then smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, I'm going on about former staff when you're here to learn about our current programs." "Not at all," Richard assured her. "I find that the people behind an organization often reveal its true character. This Grace Sullivan sounds like she embodied your mission well." "She did," Delia agreed. "Would you like to see our Family Counseling Center next? It's a newer addition we're quite proud of." As they continued the tour, Richard maintained his role as the interested philanthropist, but his mind was racing. Savannah, Georgia. It wasn't definitive, but it was the first concrete lead they'd had. The remainder of the visit passed without further mention of Grace Sullivan, though Richard made a significant donation before leaving, partly to maintain his cover, but also out of genuine respect for the work being done there. Back in the car, Emily finally let her excitement show. "Savannah, we have a location." "A possible location," Richard cautioned, though he shared her optimism. "From 5 years ago." "It's more than we had this morning," Emily pointed out. "And did you notice how Delia talked about her with real affection? She said the children adored her." Richard had noticed. It was another piece of the puzzle. His mother wasn't just surviving in her hidden life, she was making genuine connections, doing meaningful work. The Margaret Campbell in Harold's letter and the Grace Sullivan from the Children's Haven were beginning to merge into a real person in his mind. "There's something else," Emily added more quietly. "The mural in the art room. Did you look closely at the signature in the corner?" Richard hadn't. "What about it?" "It was signed GS, but underneath there was a tiny MC hidden in the design. I only noticed because I was looking for it." Richard felt his chest tighten. MC, Margaret Campbell. His mother had left her real initials, hidden in plain sight, another breadcrumb from her true identity, carefully preserved. "We need to go to Savannah," he said decisively. "When?" Emily asked, practically bouncing in her seat. Richard checked his calendar on his phone. "I have meetings here through tomorrow. We could fly to Savannah on Thursday morning. I'll have my assistant arrange accommodations." For the rest of the day, Richard went through the motions of his business meetings while his mind continually circled back to Savannah and who they might find there. His usual laser focus was compromised, something his business associates might have been shocked to witness. That evening, as they dined on the townhouse balcony, the sultry New Orleans night wrapping around them, Emily seemed unusually contemplative. "What are you thinking about?" Richard asked, surprising himself with the in question. Personal curiosity was not his usual state. Emily poked at her dessert, a traditional bread pudding that Butler had insisted they try. "What if we find her? What will you say?" It was a question Richard had been avoiding. What do you say to a mother you've believed abandoned you for nearly 5 decades, to a woman who sacrificed everything to protect you, but in doing so, shaped your entire life around a void? "I don't know," he admitted. "I haven't gotten that far." "Are you angry with her?" Emily asked carefully. "For leaving?" "I was," Richard said after a moment, "for most of my life, but now—" He trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the complex emotions churning within him. "Now you know she didn't want to leave," Emily finished for him. "Yes, but knowing why doesn't erase 47 years of absence." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "My mom always said your mom never stopped loving you, that she kept track of you from a distance, newspaper articles, business news. She knew you were successful." The thought of his mother following his career from afar, proud but unable to tell him so, sent an unexpected pang through Richard's chest. "What if—" Emily hesitated. "What if she doesn't want to be found?" It was a possibility Richard had considered. If Margaret Campbell had gone to such lengths to remain hidden, perhaps she preferred to stay that way. Perhaps she had built a new life that didn't have room for the son she'd left behind. "Then we respect her wishes," Richard said finally, though the words cost him. Emily studied him across the table, her young face solemn in the candlelight. "I don't think that's what she wants. My mom said she kept the locket with your baby picture all those years. People don't do that if they want to forget." There was wisdom in her observation that belied her 13 years. Once again, Richard found himself grateful for her presence on this journey. Somehow, this unexpected child had become essential to his search, not just for the information she provided, but for the perspective she offered. As the lights of New Orleans twinkled below them, and the distant sound of jazz floated on the night air, Richard allowed himself to hope. In 2 days, they would be in Savannah, one step closer to answers he'd never thought to seek. Savannah greeted them with gentle sunshine filtering through Spanish moss, a stark contrast to New Orleans' sultry intensity. Richard had secured accommodations in a historic inn overlooking Forsyth Park, its graceful architecture and southern hospitality creating an atmosphere of genteel tranquility. "It feels peaceful here," Emily observed as they walked through the park that afternoon, having arrived earlier than expected when Richard's business meeting in New Orleans concluded early. "I can imagine why someone looking for a safe place might choose Savannah," Richard nodded, taking in the ancient oak trees and carefully tended gardens. Unlike Boston's frantic pace or New Orleans' vibrant chaos, Savannah moved with deliberate grace, its historic squares creating natural pauses in the city's rhythm. Their search strategy here was less defined. The donation from Savannah to the New Orleans Children's Center was their only concrete lead, which meant they needed to explore organizations similar to the Children's Haven, places where a woman with Grace Sullivan's background might find employment. "I've made a list," Emily said, consulting her ever-present notebook. "There are 4 children's therapy centers in Savannah proper, 2 family crisis centers, and a children's hospital with an art therapy program. Where should we start?" Richard considered their options. The hospital seems most promising. Larger organization, better funding for specialized therapy. Programs. Emily nodded in agreement. "And we have an appointment there tomorrow morning." "We do?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "I called yesterday, while you were in your meeting," Emily admitted. "I said I was your assistant, scheduling a tour for a potential donor interested in children's mental health programs." Richard shook his head, caught between amusement and disapproval. "You're becoming alarmingly proficient at deception. I prefer to think of it as creative problem-solving," Emily replied with a hint of mischief. "Besides, it worked. We have a tour at 9 tomorrow with the head of their therapy department." That evening, after a quiet dinner at their inn, Emily fell asleep early, the excitement and travel catching up with her. Richard found himself restless and decided to take a walk through Savannah's historic district. The night was mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of a street musician's saxophone. As he wandered through one of Savannah's many squares, Richard found himself contemplating how much his life had changed in just a few months. The driven, isolated man who had dismissed a sick child at his door now traveled with that same child in search of a mother he'd thought lost forever. It wasn't just his daily routine that had shifted, but something more fundamental, the lens through which he viewed the world and his place in it. His phone rang, interrupting his reflections. It was Barnes, calling about a contract negotiation in Singapore that required Richard's input. He handled it efficiently, but the intrusion of his real life felt jarring in this context. The Richard Campbell who commanded global real estate deals felt increasingly distant from the man walking through Savannah in search of his past. When morning came, they presented themselves at Memorial Children's Hospital, where a brisk woman named Dr. Janine Foster greeted them in the lobby. "Mr. Campbell, it's a pleasure to meet you, and this must be Emily." Dr. Foster shook their hands with professional warmth. "I understand you're interested in our therapeutic arts program?" "Yes," Richard confirmed. "I've recently expanded my foundation's focus to include children's mental health initiatives, and I'm particularly interested in art therapy applications." "Well, you've come to the right place," Dr. Foster said proudly. "Our program is one of the most comprehensive in the Southeast." The tour was informative and impressive. The hospital's art therapy wing was bright and welcoming, featuring patient artwork prominently displayed and multiple specialized rooms for different creative modalities. Throughout, Richard asked informed questions while Emily observed silently, both of them alert for any mention or sign of Grace Sullivan. "The program has grown significantly in the past 4 years," Dr. Foster explained as they viewed a group therapy room. "When I took over, we had just 2 therapists. Now we have a team of 6 full-time art therapists and several part-time specialists." "That's remarkable growth," Richard commented. "What sparked the expansion?" "Honestly, a confluence of need, vision, and the right personnel." Dr. Foster's expression grew thoughtful. "We had an exceptional therapist join us about 4 years ago who really transformed our approach. Her integration of trauma-informed practices with traditional art therapy techniques became our new standard of care." Emily and Richard exchanged subtle glances. "She sounds impressive," Richard said carefully. "Is she still with your program?" "Grace? Absolutely. In fact, she's our associate director now." Dr. Foster checked her watch. "She should be finishing her morning session soon. Would you like to meet her? Her perspective would be valuable given your interests." Richard felt his heart rate accelerate, something that hadn't happened in a business setting for decades. Yes, we'd appreciate that. And very much. Dr. Foster led them to a small waiting area outside the therapy offices. Make yourselves comfortable. I'll see if Grace is available. When she disappeared down the hall, Emily gripped Richard's arm with surprising strength. Do you think it's her? She whispered urgently. It could be, Richard replied, keeping his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The timing fits. The name fits. What if it's not? Or what if it is, but she doesn't recognize you, or doesn't want to? Emily, Richard said gently, covering her hand with his own. One step at a time. They sat in tense silence for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then footsteps approached, and Dr. Foster returned, accompanied by a woman in her 70s. She was petite, with silver-gray hair styled in a simple bob, wearing a colorful scarf over a navy blouse and tailored pants. Her face was lined but graceful, with intelligent eyes behind tasteful glasses. Nothing about her was remarkable or distinctive, except to Richard, who found himself staring at features he hadn't seen in 47 years, but somehow recognized instantly. Mr. Campbell, Emily, this is Grace Sullivan, our Associate Director of Therapeutic Arts, Dr. Foster said. Grace, this is Richard Campbell and his ward, Emily. Mr. Campbell is considering supporting children's mental health initiatives. Grace. Sullivan extended her hand with a professional smile. It's a pleasure to meet you both. Janine tells me you're particularly interested in art therapy applications. Her voice was calm and pleasant, with no hint of recognition or alarm. Nothing to suggest she was face to face with the son she had left behind nearly 5 decades ago. Richard took her offered hand, finding his own voice with effort. Yes, that's correct. Your program comes highly recommended. If she noticed anything unusual in his response, she didn't show it. Her eyes moved easily between Richard and Emily, professional and engaged, but without any special focus. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have, Grace said. Perhaps you'd like to see our individual therapy rooms. We've developed some innovative approaches there. Dr. Foster's pager beeped, and she checked it with a small frown. I'm afraid I'm needed for a consultation. Grace, could you continue the tour? I'll try to rejoin you before they leave. Of course, Grace agreed readily. As Dr. Foster hurried away, Grace turned back to them with a warm smile. Shall we? The individual therapy rooms are just down this hall. She led them through the department with practiced ease, explaining their therapeutic approaches and showing examples of patient artwork. Throughout, Richard studied her carefully, looking for any slip, any sign that she recognized him. But she maintained her professional demeanor flawlessly. It was Emily who finally broke the script. As Grace was explaining a particular therapeutic technique using clay work, Emily interrupted softly. The locket you're wearing, she said, pointing to a silver chain just visible at Grace's collar. It's beautiful. Grace's hand moved automatically to her necklace. Oh, thank you. It's very special to me. May I see it? Emily asked with innocent curiosity. A flicker of hesitation crossed Grace's face, but her professional training won out. Of course, she said, pulling the chain from beneath her blouse to reveal a silver locket, the twin of the one Emily had given Richard. Emily leaned forward, then said quietly, My heart outside my body. Grace froze, her composure cracking for the first time. Her eyes widened as they fixed on Emily with sudden intensity. What did you say? My heart outside my body, Emily repeated. That's what's inscribed inside, isn't it? Just like in the one you gave to Jane Dawson for safekeeping. Grace's gaze darted from Emily to Richard, truly seeing him for the first time. The professional mask dissolved completely, replaced by naked shock and something deeper, a profound, aching recognition. Richard, she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. Richard nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. How? Grace began, but couldn't continue. Her hand clutched the... Lock it so tightly her knuckles whitened. Your friend Jane Dawson passed away, Richard said gently. Before she died, she asked Emily, her daughter, to deliver a letter from my father to me. A letter explaining the truth. Tears filled Grace's eyes. Jane is gone. And you're Emily? She turned to the girl with dawning comprehension. Jane's little Emily. Emily nodded. She made me promise to find you after we delivered the letter. A tear slipped down Grace's cheek. And Harold? The letter was from Harold. He died 3 months ago. Richard confirmed. His letter explained everything. Why you left, what really happened, the truth he'd hidden from me all these years. Grace swayed slightly, and Richard instinctively stepped forward to steady her. The contact, the first between mother and son in 47 years, seemed to break whatever restraint remained. She reached up with trembling fingers to touch his face. "My boy," she whispered. "My beautiful boy." The world around them faded as Richard Campbell, who had faced down corporate giants without flinching, who had built an empire on calculated control, found himself enveloped in his mother's embrace, tears he didn't know he had left flowing freely down his face. Over his mother's shoulder, he met Emily's eyes. She was crying too, but smiling through her tears, witness to the miracle she had helped create. In that moment, Richard knew with absolute certainty that finding his mother wasn't the end of their journey together, but only the beginning. 6 months later, Boston's autumn painted the trees around Campbell Estate in brilliant shades of red and gold. The mansion itself seemed transformed. Windows that had once remained darkened now glowed with warm light, and rooms that had echoed with emptiness now resonated with life. In the grand dining room, a celebration was underway. The long mahogany table that had rarely seen more than solitary meals now accommodated a small but significant gathering. Richard sat at the head, not in the stiff, formal posture of a CEO, but relaxed, his attention focused on the people around him rather than on business concerns. To his right sat Margaret Campbell, known legally now by her true name again, after decades as Grace Sullivan. At 73, she carried her age with grace and energy, her silver hair elegantly styled, her eyes bright with a joy that had been hard-won. The months since their reunion in Savannah had been a delicate dance of reconnection, of stories shared and wounds acknowledged, of building a relationship that had been violently interrupted nearly 5 decades before. "More potatoes, Emily?" Margaret asked, passing the serving dish to the girl seated opposite her. Emily, now 14 and noticeably healthier than the desperate child who had appeared at Richard's door in the storm, smiled and accepted the offering. "Thanks, Margaret," she said, the name still somewhat new on her tongue. They were all finding their way with names and titles, identities and relationships still taking shape. Beside Emily sat Mrs. Winters, invited to join the family dinner in recognition of her role in what Margaret had begun calling the miracle. May, the housekeeper's initial stiffness had melted into genuine warmth, especially toward Emily, whom she had quietly taken under her wing over the past months. "The paperwork is finally complete," Richard announced, setting down his glass. "All the I's dotted, all the T's crossed. The judge signed off this morning." He turned to Emily with unusual gentleness in his expression. "It's official now, if you still want it to be." Emily's fork paused midway to her mouth. "Really? It went through?" Richard nodded. "As of 9:17 this morning, you are legally Emily Campbell, my daughter." The word daughter still felt foreign on his tongue, but increasingly right. The temporary guardianship that had begun as a practical solution for their investigation had evolved almost imperceptibly into something neither of them had anticipated, but both had come to want. Emily's eyes glistened. "So the new school registration will be under your new legal name," Richard confirmed. "You start next month as planned." Margaret reached across the table to squeeze Emily's hand. "Congratulations, sweetheart." though I've considered you family since the moment you found me." The bond between Emily and Margaret had formed almost instantly. The girl who had lost her mother finding a grandmother figure, and the woman who had been forced to abandon her child finding a second chance at family. They shared a love of art, books, and quiet determination that seemed to transcend their brief acquaintance. "To new beginnings," Mrs. Winters proposed, raising her glass in a rare display of sentiment. They toasted, the crystal ringing clear in the room that had once known only silence. Later, as dusk settled over the estate, Richard found himself alone with his mother on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in deepening shades of orange and pink. They sat in comfortable silence, a luxury they'd learned to appreciate after decades of absence and months of catching up. "She's remarkable," Margaret said finally, glancing back toward the house where Emily was showing Mrs. Winters her latest drawings. "Jane would be so proud of her," Richard nodded. "She's resilient and surprisingly wise for her age." "Rather like someone else I know," Margaret said with a gentle smile. "You were always an old soul, even at 5. These moments still caught Richard off guard. Casual references to his childhood, glimpses of who he had been before loss and lies had hardened him. Each one was both painful and precious. "I never thought I'd be a father," he admitted. "It wasn't part of my plan." Margaret's laugh was soft. "Life rarely follows our plans. I certainly never planned to spend 47 years away from my only child." There was no bitterness in her voice, though she had every right to it. In the months since their reunion, Richard had learned the full story of her years in hiding. The constant fear, the series of reinvented identities, the loneliness she endured to keep him safe. The men his father had owed money to had been part of an organized crime syndicate, and the threat had been very real. Only in the past decade, with most of the key players dead or imprisoned, had Margaret begun to feel truly safe. "I've been thinking," Richard said, turning to face her directly, "about your work at the hospital. You don't have to give it up." Margaret looked surprised. "But the move, we can arrange something. Regular trips to Savannah, or perhaps a position with a Boston hospital." Richard's tone was decisive, the problem solver emerging. "The work matters to you. I don't want you to sacrifice it again." Margaret reached over to cover his hand with hers, a gesture that had become familiar these past months. "Thank you, but I've already spoken with Memorial. They've agreed to let me consult remotely and visit quarterly." Her eyes crinkled with amusement. "I'm quite capable of arranging my own life, you know. I've had decades of practice." Richard felt properly chastised, but also relieved. "Of course, I just don't want you to feel you have to choose. The only choice that matters is already made," Margaret said firmly. "I'm where I belong now, with my family." Family. The word still felt new to Richard, a concept he was relearning from the ground up. His entire adult identity had been built around its absence. The abandoned son, the solitary titan, the man who needed no one. Now he found himself not only reunited with his mother, but also a father to a teenage girl, roles he was still learning to navigate. "There's something else we need to discuss," Richard said, shifting to more practical matters. "The foundation." Since their return from Savannah, Richard had been working with his legal team to establish the New Dawn Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to helping children in crisis situations. The project had consumed much of his attention, a redirection of energy that surprised his business associates but felt increasingly right. "The launch is set for next month," he continued. "I'd like you to be part of it. Your expertise in childhood trauma would be invaluable to our program development." Margaret's eyes brightened. "I'd be honored, though I think Emily should be involved too. Her perspective as someone who's been through the system would give us insights we might otherwise miss." "Already arranged," Richard said with a small smile. "She's been helping design the Youth Advisory Council. It was her idea, actually." Pride flickered across Margaret's face. Pride in her son, in her unexpected granddaughter, in the family taking shape from the fragments of the past. Inside the house, they heard Emily call for them. Dinner was transitioning to dessert, and their presence was requested. Richard stood, offering his arm to his mother in a gesture that had quickly become habit. As they walked back inside, Margaret paused, looking up at the home that had once been Harold Campbell's fortress and was now becoming something else entirely. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I worried about what I would find when Jane's daughter delivered that letter. I feared what Harold's influence might have made of you." Richard understood her concern all too well. He had spent most of his life becoming exactly what his father had wanted: cold, calculating, successful at all costs. "And what did you find?" he asked quietly. Margaret's eyes, so like his own, met his with unmistakable love. "I found my son, a little lost, perhaps, a little guarded, but with a heart still capable of opening." She glanced toward Emily, who was setting out dessert plates with Mrs. Winters, "Capable of saving a child in the rain, capable of becoming more than your father ever imagined." The words washed over him with healing power. For so long, Richard had measured himself against Harold Campbell's exacting standards, seeking approval from a man incapable of giving it. Now, standing in the warm light of his mother's regard, he felt something shift and settle within him. Not the final healing of a lifetime's wound, but a significant step forward. "Come on," he said, gently guiding her toward the dining room. "I'm told Mrs. Winters has prepared her famous apple tart, and Emily will be devastated if we miss it." As they rejoined the gathering, Richard took his place at the head of the table, but with none of the isolation that position had once held. To his right, his mother engaged Emily in animated conversation about the upcoming school term. To his left, Mrs. Winters discreetly supervised the serving of dessert, while adding occasional comments to the discussion. Looking at the three of them, this improbable family assembled from loss and chance and choice, Richard Campbell felt the last empty chambers of his heart fill with something he had never dared to seek, but now recognized as essential: belonging. The empire he had built still stood. The wealth he had accumulated remained, but their meaning had fundamentally changed. What had once been a fortress against abandonment was becoming a foundation for connection. What had once been proof of his worth was now simply a tool to protect and provide for those he loved. As Emily launched into an elaborate description of her plans for the Foundation's youth programs, her eyes bright with purpose, Richard caught his mother watching him with quiet understanding. She had seen the transformation in him, just as he had witnessed her journey from Grace Sullivan back to Margaret Campbell. They were, all of them, works in progress, broken by the past, but not defined by it, finding their way toward wholeness in one another's company. And for Richard Campbell, who had once had everything money could buy and nothing that truly mattered, it was more than enough. It was everything.